What drives a young king to challenge the world's greatest empire? At just 20 years old, Alexander of Macedonia inherited a kingdom on the verge of chaos, and within a few short years, he would shock the ancient world. From crushing Greek rebellions to battling vast Persian armies, Alexander's campaign was more than conquest. It was the creation of legend. Each step he took pushed him closer to the edge of the known world, revealing not just his military genius, but also his ruthless ambition, his charisma, and his vision of empire. This is the story of one man's relentless pursuit of immortality through battle, brilliance, and blood. Before we dive into this epic journey, don't forget to support our channel Sleep Stories TV by liking, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Your support helps us bring more captivating history to life, so settle in and let the saga begin. When Alexander the Great rose to the throne of Macedonia in 336 BCE, he was only 20 years old. Yet the challenges before him were immense and immediate. His father, Philip II, had just been assassinated, most likely as part of a conspiracy involving members of the royal court. The murder plunged the kingdom into uncertainty. Though Philip had built Macedonia into a military powerhouse and united most of the Greek city-states under his hegemony, through the League of Corinth, his sudden death threatened to unravel it all. Many viewed Alexander as too young and inexperienced to maintain his father's empire. What followed would prove those doubters fatally wrong. Even before the echoes of Philip's funeral had faded, Alexander acted with force and precision. There were rivals to eliminate, allies to secure, and territories to stabilize. The first threats came not from distant enemies, but from within the royal court. Alexander's succession was not guaranteed. Some Macedonian nobles supported other potential claimants, especially those connected to Philip's other wives. One of the most significant threats was Attalus, a powerful and ambitious general related to Cleopatra Eurydice, Philip's latest wife. Some factions hoped to use Attalus as a figurehead to oppose Alexander. Alexander wasted no time. He moved swiftly to consolidate his claim by eliminating opposition. He ordered the execution of Attalus and others suspected of conspiracy. Even members of his own extended family, including Philip's young widow and her child, were reportedly put to death or disappeared from historical record. These early purges, though brutal, sent a clear message Alexander would not share power, and he would tolerate no rival. Meanwhile, unrest was growing beyond Macedonia's borders. Several northern tribes, Illyrians, Paeonians, and Thracians, saw an opportunity to break free from Macedonian dominance. More troubling still were the stirrings of rebellion in Greece. City-states like Thebes and Athens had long bristled under Macedonian rule. Now, with Philip dead and Alexander untested, they believed the time had come to reassert their independence. The Greek orator Demosthenes even began rallying opposition to the Macedonian regime, hoping to fracture the League of Corinth that Philip had so carefully constructed. Alexander, however, refused to be cornered. He responded with a speed and decisiveness that caught everyone off guard. While many of his advisors urged caution, Alexander embraced bold action. He personally led a lightning-fast campaign northward, subduing the rebellious tribes. In Thrace, he demonstrated not only military prowess, but also a talent for strategy and surprise. When facing opposition at Mount Haemus, he used clever tactics to avoid being crushed by enemy chariots and routed the defenders, restoring order in the region with minimal losses. With the northern front secured, he turned south to Greece. He took with him a small elite force of cavalry, only a few thousand men, but he moved with such speed and confidence that Greek city-states were caught completely off guard. At the Vale of Tempe, the natural pass between Macedonia and central Greece, he encountered a Thessalian army that refused to let him pass. Rather than wasting time in negotiation, Alexander ordered his men to scale the steep and treacherous slopes of Mount Ossa, flanking the enemy from behind. This daring maneuver shocked the defenders into submission, and Alexander was welcomed as their leader. His pace did not slow. Within days, he arrived at Thermopylae and was declared commander of the Amphictyonic League, a religious and symbolic title that granted him further legitimacy among the Greeks. He then made a direct march on Thebes, one of the most powerful and fiercely independent city-states in Greece. The Thebans, misinformed and perhaps deluded into thinking Alexander had died during his northern campaign, had risen in revolt. They murdered the Macedonian garrison stationed in their city and declared their independence from Macedonian rule. This rebellion would become Alexander's first major test as king and his first infamous act of total war. Arriving unexpectedly outside Thebes with a full army, he gave the city one last chance to surrender. When the Thebans refused and arrogantly demanded that Alexander hand over his own generals, he unleashed his forces. The siege was short and devastating. Macedonian soldiers, disciplined and vengeful, breached the walls, slaughtered thousands, and captured many more. By Alexander's orders, or at least with his consent, the entire city was destroyed. Its citizens were either killed or sold into slavery, and only a few religious sites were spared. The obliteration of Thebes was more than retribution. It was psychological warfare. News of the city's destruction spread rapidly throughout Greece. Athens, which had been teetering on the edge of revolt, immediately backed down and sent envoys to declare allegiance. Other city-states followed suit. Within weeks, Alexander had secured the submission of the entire Greek world. His brutal response at Thebes ensured that no other city would dare to challenge him for now. These early months of Alexander's reign were transformative. He had begun his rule under a cloud of doubt, faced internal and external enemies, and held together a fragile empire on the verge of splintering. Yet through audacity, military genius, and sheer force of will, he not only stabilized the Macedonian kingdom, but expanded its dominance. In doing so, he also laid the foundation for something far greater than any of his contemporaries could imagine. The young king, who crushed rebellions with fire and steel, was now ready to turn his gaze eastward toward the vast and ancient empire of Persia. The destruction of Thebes stands as one of the most chilling and decisive acts in Alexander's early reign, a moment that reshaped the political landscape of Greece and set the tone for what was to come. Following the death of Philip II, Thebes, like many other Greek city-states, had begun to test the limits of Macedonian authority. The city had always been a proud and formidable force in Greek affairs, with a long history of military might and political independence. Even under Philip's rule, Thebes had been restive. Now, with a 20-year-old king on the Macedonian throne, Theban leaders believed they could seize the moment and reclaim their autonomy. What Thebes did not yet understand was that Alexander was not a mere inheritor of his father's conquests. He was determined to rule in his own name and to do so with an iron will. As he campaigned in the north, suppressing revolts and pacifying the tribes of Thrace and Illyria, rumors began circulating across the Greek world that Alexander had perished in battle. These rumors, likely encouraged by orators such as Demosthenes of Athens, spread quickly and gave hope to those who chafed under Macedonian domination. For Thebes, it was the opportunity they had been waiting for. Acting on the belief that Alexander was dead or far away, Theban leaders moved quickly. They expelled the Macedonian garrison stationed at the Cadmea, the city's fortified citadel, and took up arms against Macedonia. They called upon other Greek city-states to join them, raising the banner of Hellenic freedom against northern tyranny. Athens, long hostile to Macedon, expressed moral support and prepared troops, though they hesitated to commit fully. Other states watched closely, curious to see whether this bold act of defiance would ignite a broader rebellion. But Alexander was very much alive, and he was furious. Upon receiving word of Thebes' rebellion, he wasted no time. Marching with a hardened, battle-tested army of more than 30,000 troops, he descended from the mountains of Illyria with astonishing speed. His march through Thessaly and central Greece was so rapid that many cities had no time to react. The sheer audacity of his movement caught the Greek world off guard. When Thebes realized that Alexander himself had arrived at their gates, it was already too late. Alexander did not seek to negotiate. He offered only one condition for peace, that the Thebans hand over the two main leaders of the revolt. Thebes refused, demanding instead that Alexander surrender two of his own generals in exchange. The defiance was breathtaking. In response, Alexander prepared for war. The Macedonian siege of Thebes was swift and brutal. Though the Thebans were brave and their city well fortified, they stood little chance against the full might of the Macedonian war machine. The battle that followed was short but intense. Alexander divided his army into 3 divisions and launched a coordinated assault on the city. His troops overwhelmed Theban defenses with precision and ruthless efficiency. One of his generals, Perdiccas, reportedly broke through the walls at a weak point, allowing Macedonian forces to flood into the city. From that moment, the outcome was certain. What followed was not just a military victory, but a devastating act of vengeance. The city of Thebes was subjected to complete destruction. According to ancient sources, more than 6,000 Thebans were killed in the fighting, and another 30,000 were enslaved. Houses were looted, and then demolished temples were spared, but little else. The once proud city, a place with centuries of cultural and political significance, was reduced to rubble. Only the Cadmea citadel and certain religious sites were left standing as a grim monument to the wrath of Alexander. Across Greece, the impact was immediate and profound. The sack of Thebes was not merely a punishment for rebellion, it was a carefully calculated message. It demonstrated beyond any doubt that Alexander would not tolerate dissent, and that the consequences for defiance would be total. The psychological effect was immense. Athens, which had been preparing for possible war, suddenly reversed course and sued for peace. The other members of the League of Corinth fell into line with chilling obedience. No one wanted to become the next Thebes. Even within Alexander's own ranks, there were murmurs of discomfort. Some of his advisors had counseled moderation, warning that brutality might alienate the Greek city-states permanently. But Alexander was not interested in half measures. He believed that fear was a more reliable tool than persuasion, and in this he was proven correct. The destruction of Thebes silenced Greek resistance for the remainder of his lifetime. Still, the decision would haunt his reputation. Later, historians would debate whether the action had been justified or excessive. Some, such as Arian, argued that the sack was encouraged by Thebes' enemies within Greece, and that Alexander simply allowed it to proceed. Others, including Diodorus, held him directly responsible. What is undeniable is that Alexander had the power to prevent the destruction and chose not to. Whether motivated by strategic necessity or personal rage, the outcome was the same. The fall of Thebes marked a turning point. It solidified Alexander's control over Greece and allowed him to pursue his grander ambitions without fear of revolt at home. With Greece pacified, he could now turn his attention eastward toward the Persian Empire, the greatest power in the world at that time. But the ghost of Thebes would follow him. It served as a reminder to friend and foe alike that Alexander was not merely a charismatic leader or a brilliant general. He was a conqueror, and he would let nothing stand in his way. Before Alexander could realize his grand vision of conquering the Persian Empire, he had to secure the stability of his own borders. Although Greece had been subdued with terrifying finality following the destruction of Thebes, the northern frontiers of the Macedonian kingdom still posed a serious threat. The tribal regions of Thrace and Illyria, rugged, mountainous, and filled with fierce, independent peoples, had not accepted Macedonian authority quietly under Philip II, and they certainly had no intention of bowing to his young successor without resistance. If Alexander was to launch a campaign into Asia, he could not risk leaving these volatile regions behind him, free to rise in rebellion or strike while his army was away. In the spring of 335 BCE, less than a year after his ascension, Alexander embarked on a campaign into the Balkan territories. The speed with which he transitioned from the destruction of Thebes to the march north is a testament to his boundless energy and tactical urgency. He knew that time was of the essence. The Persian Empire loomed large in the east, but first he needed to assert dominance over the warlike tribes threatening Macedonia's northern border. He began by marching into Thrace, where he encountered the first major obstacle at Mount Haemus, a mountainous region that served as a natural fortress for the Thracian tribes. The enemy had fortified a narrow pass with wagons and prepared to use the terrain to their advantage. It was a clever tactic designed to block Alexander's advance and crush his soldiers under a barrage of rolling wagons and missiles. But Alexander, always quick to adapt, anticipated the maneuver. He had trained his phalanx for this kind of warfare. When the wagons came crashing down the slopes, his men either lay flat beneath their shields or parted ranks to let the carts pass harmlessly through. It was a brilliant and disciplined display, and it allowed them to ascend the pass and rout the Thracian defenders with minimal loss. With the pass secured, Alexander pressed on through the region, dealing with each tribe as he encountered them. Resistance was fierce in places, but none of the tribal chieftains could match the discipline and strategic superiority of the Macedonian army. Alexander's forces were battle-hardened, unified, and under the command of a leader who inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure. One of the most extraordinary episodes of this campaign came at the Danube River. Alexander faced the Tribalians, a powerful tribe that attempted to avoid confrontation by fleeing to a heavily fortified island in the middle of the river. This strategy might have deterred a lesser general, but Alexander saw it as an opportunity to showcase his ingenuity. With the help of his engineers, he ordered the construction of makeshift rafts and floatable craft using tents stuffed with hay. Under the cover of night, Alexander ferried a strike force across the Danube, 4,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry to catch the enemy off guard. As dawn broke, the Macedonians launched a surprise assault from a field of tall grain using their long sarissas to flatten the crops as they advanced. The Getae, a nomadic group allied with the Tribalians, were stunned. Panic spread as Alexander's cavalry smashed into their flanks. The Getae fled, abandoning their stronghold and scattering across the plains. The maneuver was bold, risky, and executed with precision. In its wake, Alexander received not only tribute from the defeated tribes, but also overtures of friendship from neighboring peoples, including a delegation of Celts who famously told Alexander they feared only that the sky might fall on their heads. Though victorious, Alexander did not allow himself to linger. There were still threats to neutralize, and he moved westward into Illyria. There, he confronted the tribes of King Clytus and King Glaucius, who had formed an alliance against him. The Illyrians retreated into the mountain fortress of Pelium, confident that their position was impregnable. The citadel was surrounded by dense forests and high ridges, making it a formidable challenge for any besieging army. Alexander encamped before the fortress and began setting up his siege equipment, but soon found himself in a precarious situation. Glaucius' forces had arrived and encircled the Macedonians from the surrounding hills, trapping Alexander's army in a narrow plain. Supplies were running low, and retreat through the pass would expose his forces to a deadly ambush. At this critical juncture, Alexander did something extraordinary. Rather than attempt to withdraw quietly, he staged a dazzling military parade. He ordered his soldiers into tight formations and had them perform synchronized drills, shifting formations, raising and lowering spears, and slamming them against shields in thunderous unison. The spectacle unnerved the Illyrians watching from the hills. They had never seen anything like it, a silent army moving like clockwork, without panic or hesitation. The psychological impact was immediate. When Alexander gave the order to attack, his men surged forward with such confidence and precision that they overwhelmed the enemy and secured an escape route. Even more impressively, Alexander would return just days later to catch the Illyrians off guard in a night assault, scattering them completely and re-establishing Macedonian control over the region. With the Balkans pacified, Alexander turned his gaze eastward once more. But even as he prepared to launch his campaign into Persia, troubling news reached him from the south. Thebes, emboldened by false rumors of his death, had risen in open revolt. Macedonian officials had been killed, and the city was rallying others to join the resistance. It was a dangerous moment, threatening to undo everything Alexander had achieved. Yet again, he moved with breathtaking speed. In just 2 weeks, Alexander marched his army through rugged terrain to the gates of Thebes. What followed would become one of the most infamous episodes in Greek history: the total destruction of Thebes, the slaughter of its defenders, and the enslavement of its people. But this brutal act would not be the end of Alexander's fury. It would merely clear the path for something even greater. Having subdued the north and terrorized the south into obedience, Alexander was now free to pursue the dream that had defined his father's final years and now burned even brighter in the sun. The Persian Empire, vast and ancient, stood across the Hellespont. Alexander would not wait long before setting sail. His homeland was now secure. His enemies had been broken. The road to Asia had opened, and he intended to follow it all the way to its end. In the spring of 334 BCE, having secured his borders and silenced rebellion across Greece and the Balkans, Alexander the Great stood at the threshold of the ancient world's greatest empire. The Persian Empire, vast, wealthy, and deeply entrenched, spanned from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley. It had once brought Athens to its knees and ruled over countless peoples from Egypt to Central Asia. Now, the young Macedonian king was ready to challenge its dominance. It was a mission that had once belonged to his father Philip II, who dreamed of leading a pan-Hellenic crusade to avenge the Persian invasions of Greece 2 centuries earlier. But that dream had died with Philip's assassination. Now, it was Alexander's to fulfill and to redefine. At the time, Alexander was just 22 years old, yet he was already known as a brilliant commander, both feared and respected. He had united Greece through force and diplomacy, crushed multiple tribal coalitions in the north, and destroyed Thebes as a warning to all who dared oppose him. Now, he turned east with a force of roughly 35,000 troops, about 32,000 infantry, and 5,000 cavalry. This army was not large by the standards of the Persian Empire, which could summon hundreds of thousands of soldiers if needed. But it was the best trained, best equipped, and most cohesive fighting force in the world at the time. It was an army built not just for conquest, but for glory. To cross into Asia, Alexander followed in the path of myth. He first traveled to the city of Troy, the legendary site of the Trojan War, described in Homer's Iliad, a text Alexander adored. There he made sacrifices to Athena and honored the tombs of Achilles and Patroclus. In an almost theatrical gesture, he exchanged his own armor for sacred weapons housed at the temple of Athena, and symbolically took up the mantle of Homer's greatest hero. This blending of religion ritual and personal mythology was central to Alexander's identity and essential to the way he presented himself to his troops and subjects alike. The actual crossing of the Hellespont, the narrow waterway separating Europe from Asia, was a logistical feat. Alexander coordinated a large-scale naval effort, moving soldiers, horses, equipment, and supplies across the strait. While his general Parmenion handled the bulk of the work, Alexander made a point of personally leading the first wave. As his ship approached the Asian shore, he supposedly hurled a spear into the sand and proclaimed that he had claimed the land by right of conquest. It was a dramatic gesture, part declaration of war and part divine performance. Once on Asian soil, Alexander began organizing his troops and preparing for battle. The Persian satraps, provincial governors in Asia Minor, had already begun to mobilize. A coalition of Persian and mercenary forces led by satraps such as Arsites and Spithridates, along with the experienced Greek commander Memnon of Rhodes, gathered near the river Granicus to halt Alexander's advance. Memnon, a seasoned general, advised the Persian satraps to avoid direct confrontation and instead use a scorched earth policy to deny Alexander food and supplies. It was sound advice, But the satraps, unwilling to devastate their own provinces, and perhaps suspicious of Memnon's Greek heritage, chose to ignore it. Instead, they decided to confront Alexander in battle. As Alexander advanced inland, he encountered the Persian army at the Granicus River. What followed was the first major battle of his campaign, and a harrowing one. The Persian cavalry was drawn up along the far side of the riverbank, with Greek mercenary infantry held in reserve. It was a daring position, as the steep banks made an attack hazardous for any force attempting to cross. Alexander's advisors, including Parmenion, urged him to wait and cross the river in the morning when the terrain would be more favorable. But Alexander, ever eager for bold action and personal glory, rejected this counsel. Wearing shining armor and mounted on his horse, Bucephalus Alexander led a direct charge across the river. His companion cavalry followed crashing into the Persian line as archers and javelin throwers attempted to halt the assault. The riverbed was slippery and the banks steep, but the momentum and discipline of the Macedonian cavalry began to turn the tide. Alexander himself became the focus of Persian attacks. Several enemy commanders converged on him, and during the melee, his helmet was struck and broken. One Persian warrior raised a sword to kill him, but in the final moment, one of Alexander's bodyguards, Cletus the Black, intervened, cutting off the man's arm and saving the king's life. The battle continued to rage, but the Macedonian phalanx soon crossed the river and joined the fight. The disciplined infantry formations pressed forward, wielding their long sarissas and pushing the Persian cavalry back. Once the cavalry had been scattered, Alexander turned his attention to the Greek mercenaries who had yet to fully engage. Surrounded and with nowhere to retreat, they fought bravely, but Alexander ordered a massacre. Thousands were killed, and many survivors were enslaved and sent back to Macedonia as a warning to others. The brutality of this act shocked even some of Alexander's allies, but it sent a powerful message. Anyone who fought against him, Greek or foreigner, would receive no mercy. The victory at the Granicus River was a turning point. It opened the gates of Asia Minor to Alexander. City after city fell to him in the aftermath, either by siege or surrender. In Sardis, the Persian satrap surrendered without resistance. In Ephesus, Alexander removed tyrants and reinstated democratic governments, presenting himself as a liberator of the Greek cities under Persian control. He canceled taxes, restored civic freedoms, and used a combination of military power and political theater to win hearts and minds. His campaign through Asia Minor was not just a string of victories, it was the crafting of an image. Alexander was not merely a general, he was a symbol. To some, he was the avenger of Greece, punishing Persia for past sins. To others, he was a divine hero, destined to reshape the world. His approach was calculated, blending diplomacy with spectacle, strategy with force. By the end of the year, Alexander had secured most of Western Asia Minor. He had proven that his army could defeat the forces of Persia, that his leadership was unrivaled, and that his ambition knew no limits. Yet the Persian Empire was far from beaten. Deeper in the east, Darius III, the great king of Persia, was preparing a massive counteroffensive. But Alexander was not content with minor victories. The son of Philip had crossed into Asia not to win battles, but to win an empire. The Battle of the Granicus River was more than just Alexander's first major engagement against the Persian Empire. It was a moment of revelation, when the world first glimpsed the ambition, daring, and unflinching resolve of a young king determined to carve his name into history. Though he had already demonstrated his brilliance in battles within Greece and the Balkans, Granicus would be his first test on foreign soil against the seasoned forces of the Achaemenid Empire. It was here that Alexander's legend truly began and very nearly ended. After crossing the Hellespont into Asia, Alexander wasted no time consolidating his position. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor had assembled a joint force to meet the Macedonian invaders near the Granicus, a fast-flowing river in modern-day northwestern Turkey. The Persian commanders included experienced leaders like Arsites and Spithridates, and they were supported by a large contingent of Greek mercenaries under the command of Memnon of Rhodes. This force was not vast by Persian standards. Estimates suggest it included around 20,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantry, but it was meant to strike hard and fast, discouraging Alexander's advance before it gained momentum. Alexander, however, saw the confrontation as an opportunity, not a threat. His army, though smaller, was well trained, cohesive, and commanded with a unity that the Persians lacked. Even so, many of his advisors, including the cautious and experienced Parmenion, urged him to wait. The Persians had taken up a strong defensive position on the far bank of the river, with steep embankments, fast currents, and cavalry lined up in full battle order. Crossing under such conditions was risky. It exposed the attackers to missile fire and uphill combat. Waiting until morning, when the sun was higher and the terrain could be more easily reconnoitered, seemed the logical choice. But Alexander was not a cautious man. He was bold, theatrical, and driven by a relentless hunger for glory. He knew that a surprise attack, swift, brutal, and unexpected, could throw his enemies into disarray. And so, despite the danger, he ordered an immediate assault across the river. As his army advanced, Alexander took his position at the head of the companion cavalry, the elite mounted unit that he would lead personally in nearly every major battle of his life. Flanked by light infantry and archers, he plunged into the river, directing his forces to cross at an oblique angle. The current was swift and the footing treacherous, but Alexander and his men fought their way across weapons-raised shields held high against the barrage of arrows and javelins raining down from the opposite bank. The battle on the riverbank was fierce and chaotic. Macedonian troops struggled to gain their footing on the muddy slopes, while Persian cavalry surged forward to meet them. Swords clashed, horses screamed, and the noise of battle rose above the river's roar. At the heart of it all was Alexander, charging directly into the enemy line with reckless bravery. It was during this brutal melee that Alexander nearly lost his life. As he pushed deep into the enemy ranks, several Persian nobles recognized him and targeted him for death. He was struck by a javelin that shattered his helmet and nearly pierced his skull. Another Persian warrior, Spithridates the satrap of Lydia, raised his sword to deliver a fatal blow to the back of Alexander's head. In that moment, the future of the Macedonian campaign hung in the balance, but fate, or perhaps loyalty, intervened. Clytus, the Black One of Alexander's most trusted commanders, leapt into action. With a well-timed strike, he severed Spithridates' arm at the shoulder, saving Alexander's life in the final instant. It was a narrow escape, and one that would be remembered for years to come. Alexander, bloodied but unbroken, rallied his cavalry, and led a renewed charge that pushed the Persian lines into retreat. Once the Persian cavalry was thrown into disarray, the Macedonian phalanx, having completed its difficult crossing of the river, advanced in disciplined formation. Their long sarissas formed an impenetrable wall of spear points, and the remaining Persian forces began to break and scatter. Victory seemed inevitable, but Alexander's fury had not yet abated. With the cavalry defeated, the Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia found themselves trapped. These men, some of whom were Athenians and Thebans, had made the fatal mistake of fighting against their fellow Greeks for Persian gold. When they realized the battle was lost, they attempted to surrender. But Alexander, still bleeding from his wounds and enraged by the idea of Greeks siding with Persia, refused their pleas. He ordered a full assault, and the Macedonians fell upon the mercenaries without mercy. According to ancient sources, thousands were killed. Only a few were taken alive, and they were sent in chains to Macedonia to work in the mines. A grim warning to any Greeks who considered fighting for Persia. The brutality of this action shocked even some of Alexander's own men. It was a chilling demonstration that while Alexander could be a charismatic leader, he could also be unforgiving and ruthless when his ideals or pride were challenged. Despite the bloodshed, the victory at Granicus was total. It shattered the Persian defense of Asia Minor and gave Alexander control over the western provinces of the empire. Cities like Sardis, Ephesus, and Miletus soon surrendered or were taken by siege. In these cities, Alexander portrayed himself as a liberator, restoring democratic governments and removing pro-Persian oligarchs. It was part propaganda, part politics, and entirely strategic. In the months that followed, Alexander's reputation as an invincible commander grew. His near-death experience at Granicus only added to his mythos. He was no longer just a Macedonian king. He was becoming a hero in the classical mold, a warrior king who defied odds and destiny alike. The momentum was now firmly in his favor. The battle also served as a lesson for both Alexander and his enemies. He had learned that Persian cavalry, while formidable, could be outmaneuvered. He had also seen the danger of exposing himself too recklessly. For the Persians, Granicus was a sobering reminder that Alexander was not an upstart to be dismissed. He was a force of nature, unpredictable and relentless. As the dust settled and the dead were buried, Alexander stood on the far bank of the Granicus River, gazing into the heart of the Persian Empire. The road ahead was long and the enemy far from defeated. But the first gate had been broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. Following his victory at the Granicus River and the stunning collapse of Persian resistance in Asia Minor, Alexander might have been tempted to push deeper into enemy territory without delay. But as much as the Eastern campaign called to him, his strategic instincts would not allow him to ignore threats behind his back. For while Western Asia had submitted and the Greek cities were firmly under Macedonian control after the destruction of Thebes, the lands north of Macedonia still seethed with unrest. In the wild territories beyond the Danube home to Thracian and Getae, tribes' rumblings of defiance had begun to stir. These tribes had never truly accepted Macedonian rule. If left unchecked, they could launch raids into his homeland or even spark rebellions among other subject peoples. Before Alexander could conquer the Persian Empire, he needed to eliminate all doubt about his authority in the north. And so in early 335 BCE, Alexander turned northward once again, embarking on a campaign that would test his ingenuity and tactical brilliance as much as any major battle. The tribes he faced were scattered and decentralized. They did not possess vast, standing armies or fortified cities. Instead, they fought with mobility, ambushes, and intimate knowledge of difficult terrain. These people, Thracians, Tribalians, and Getae, were fierce and unyielding, yet Alexander would bend them to his will through a series of brilliant military maneuvers that showcased both his cunning and his adaptability. He began by marching from Amphipolis into the Thracian interior with a sizable army, approximately 30,000 troops, a mix of phalangites, light infantry, archers, and cavalry. His first major obstacle was Mount Haemus, known today as the Balkan Mountains. The Thracians had fortified a narrow defile on the lower slopes, blocking the Macedonian advance with wagons which they planned to roll down the hillside to crush Alexander's forces. But Alexander anticipated the danger. He instructed his phalanx to open gaps in their lines and flatten themselves beneath their shields when the wagons came, letting the deadly projectiles pass overhead or between the ranks. The tactic worked brilliantly. The wagons rolled harmlessly through the formations, and once the danger had passed, Alexander led a charge uphill, routing the defenders and securing the pass. Having passed Mount Haemus, he advanced into the Danubian plain and approached the territory of the Tribali, a powerful tribe led by King Syrmis. The Tribalians had prepared for Alexander's arrival by withdrawing much of their population, women, children, and elderly, to an island in the middle of the Danube, which they believed was unassailable. Meanwhile, they shadowed the Macedonian advance, with skirmishers seeking to cut off Alexander's lines of communication and supply. One force even slipped behind his army and blocked his route of retreat. Rather than panic, Alexander executed a clever trap. He baited the Tribalians into attacking his forward missile troops while hiding his cavalry and heavy infantry nearby. Once the enemy was fully engaged, the Macedonian phalanx and cavalry surged forward, from concealment, enveloping, and destroying the attacking force. Flushed with victory, Alexander marched further north, reaching the southern bank of the Danube opposite the island where Syrmis had taken refuge. There, he was met with another problem. The Macedonians had no bridges, and the current was strong. Yet Alexander refused to let a river stand in his way. He ordered the construction of makeshift rafts from inflated animal skins and bundles of straw wrapped in tents. Under cover of night and hidden by tall grass, he ferried a strike force of 4,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry across the river. When dawn broke, Alexander's troops erupted from the grain fields in tight formation. He personally led the companion cavalry in a direct assault on the Getae tribesmen who had assembled to oppose him. The shock and discipline of the Macedonian strike was overwhelming. The Getae broke and fled almost immediately, retreating into the steppes. Their city was captured and their fields were burned. It was not just a military victory, it was psychological warfare. When Syrmis learned of the battle, he quickly sent envoys to surrender. He knew that if Alexander could cross the Danube in darkness and crush a prepared army by morning, there was no hope of resisting him. At about the same time, a Celtic delegation arrived, seeking peaceful relations with the Macedonians. These Celtic warriors, enormous and fearsome in appearance, made a striking impression on Alexander. Curious, he asked them what they feared most in the world. Hoping they would say, "You the king," was instead met with an answer that would echo through history, only that the sky may fall on our heads. Though amused and perhaps a little irritated, Alexander treated the Celts with respect and sent them off peacefully. Their attitude matched his own, a fearlessness before the unknown. After securing the Danube frontier, Alexander did not stop. He turned west, entering Illyria, where a coalition of tribes had also begun preparing for war. His goal was to strike before the Illyrians could unite their forces. With swift movement and careful coordination, he launched an attack on King Cletus at the mountain fortress of Pelium. The Illyrians withdrew behind the walls, and Alexander began a siege. But his position became perilous when a second Illyrian force under King Glaucius arrived and occupied the surrounding highlands, trapping the Macedonians in a narrow valley. Faced with encirclement and a shortage of supplies, Alexander came up with a daring plan. He had his army form into ranks and perform intricate drills in full view of the enemy, marching, wheeling, raising, and lowering their spears in perfect rhythm. The sight of this mechanized discipline unnerved the Illyrians. Then, without warning, Alexander ordered a thunderous war cry and a sudden cavalry charge, sending Glaucius' men fleeing. The Macedonians seized a hill overlooking the only escape route and secured it with archers and siege engines, allowing the army to withdraw across the river in safety. Not a single Macedonian soldier was lost. Days later, with the Illyrians believing Alexander had fled, he returned under the cover of night and launched a surprise assault on their disorganized camp. The attack was devastating. Thousands of enemy warriors were killed as they slept or tried to flee. The survivors burned their fortress and disappeared into the hills. Alexander had not only escaped disaster, he had transformed a trap into a crushing victory. With the north and west pacified, Alexander returned to Macedonia. He had accomplished more in a few months than many kings achieved in years. The tribal rebellions were crushed. The Danube frontier was quiet, and his enemies either dead or too afraid to challenge him. Most importantly, the Greek city-states, watching all of this unfold, realized that Alexander's power extended beyond mere conquest. It was about control, speed, and fear. He was now free to turn his full attention to the east. The Persian Empire lay ahead, a titanic adversary ruled by King Darius III. But the lessons learned on the Danube, in the mountains of Thrace, and in the valleys of Illyria would serve Alexander well. He had proven that no terrain was too rough, no tactic too unconventional, and no enemy too wild. He was ready for the true war to begin. With Greece pacified, the northern frontiers secured, and his authority cemented across Macedonia and the Balkans, Alexander finally stood unchallenged in the west. No more revolts simmered behind him. No rival claimants stirred dissent within his court. The world he left behind was stable, but the world he looked toward was vast, ancient, and immeasurably powerful. Persia had loomed large in Greek consciousness for generations. It was the empire that had sacked Athens, that had once ruled the eastern Aegean, that had sent waves of soldiers to crush Greek independence and failed. Now, for the first time in history, the balance of power was about to shift in the opposite direction. Alexander had inherited more than an empire, he had inherited a mission. His father, Philip II, had envisioned a united Hellenic expedition to avenge the Persian invasions of the 5th century BCE. That goal had formed the foundation of the League of Corinth, a fragile alliance of Greek city-states united under Macedonian command. Philip's assassination had threatened to fracture that unity, but Alexander had acted swiftly and ruthlessly to hold it together. By razing Thebes, he sent a message that resonated from Sparta to the shores of Ionia. Resistance would be punished with annihilation. Now, with no enemies left behind him, Alexander turned his full attention eastward. He was not merely launching a military campaign. He was embarking on a civilizational confrontation. Persia was no ordinary opponent. Its empire stretched across 3 continents and encompassed hundreds of languages, cultures, and religions. It was a machine of staggering wealth and ancient authority. But Alexander did not see it as invincible. He saw it as vulnerable, bloated, and complacent. He believed with unshakable confidence that it could be brought to its knees. By early 334 BCE, Alexander had completed his preparations. He left the regency of Macedonia and control of Greek affairs in the hands of Antipater, one of his most trusted generals and political allies. Antipater would act as steward of the homeland, commanding a force of 13,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry, enough to quell any potential unrest. Meanwhile, Alexander assembled his invasion force, a diverse and formidable army of around 40,000 men, including 32,000 infantry and over 5,000 cavalry. This army was composed not only of Macedonians, but also Thracians, Illyrians, Greek mercenaries, and light troops from across the Balkans. The structure of this force reflected the sophistication of Macedonian military reforms. At its core were the phalangites infantry, armed with the massive sarissa, a pike, often more than 18 feet long. These soldiers formed the backbone of the phalanx, an impenetrable wall of spears capable of grinding down enemy formations. Supporting them were the elite hypaspists, versatile and highly trained units who could adapt to terrain and act as a bridge between the heavy phalanx and more mobile units. Alexander's cavalry was equally lethal. The companion cavalry, known as the hetairoi, was his shock force armored horsemen who fought in wedge formation and struck like thunderbolts. Alexander personally led the royal squadron, riding alongside his most loyal officers and lifelong friends, including Hephaestion and Ptolemy. On the opposite flank were the Thessalian cavalry, renowned for their discipline and battlefield prowess. Light cavalry and archers provided scouting and flexibility, while engineers, sappers, and siege experts ensured that no city could defy him for long. This was no ordinary army. It was a precision instrument trained for conquest and commanded by a man who had studied war since boyhood. Alexander had grown up reading Homer, listening to Aristotle, and training under the watchful eye of Philip's generals. He knew how to fight, but more importantly, he knew how to lead. Crossing into Asia was both symbolic and practical. The Persian Empire had long occupied territory in western Anatolia, where many Greek cities had lived under foreign control for centuries. Alexander presented himself as their liberator. When he landed at Troy and visited the tomb of Achilles, he was not just paying tribute, he was claiming lineage, invoking divine legacy, and aligning himself with the heroic past. He declared that the war ahead was not merely one of empire versus empire, but of civilization versus tyranny, of West versus East, of Greek freedom against Persian despotism. Yet Alexander's vision extended beyond vengeance. He sought not just to defeat Persia, but to replace it. From the very start, he acted not just as a conqueror, but as a ruler. Cities that surrendered were shown mercy, had their democratic institutions restored, and were often exempted from tribute. Those that resisted were dealt with swiftly and harshly, but even then, Alexander often spared civilians and made offerings at local temples. This duality, ruthless military genius and magnanimous political tactician, made his campaign not only successful, but sustainable. Still, it was not without danger. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor quickly mobilized, assembling a coalition of regional forces and mercenaries. The seasoned commander Memnon of Rhodes proposed a strategy of attrition: destroy crops, retreat inland, and draw Alexander into a war of exhaustion. But the Persian nobility, unwilling to devastate their own lands or accept the advice of a Greek, rejected the plan. Instead, they gathered their forces near the Granicus River to halt Alexander's advance in a direct confrontation. It was there that Alexander would face his first great test on Asian soil and come within inches of death. At the Battle of Granicus, he would lead his cavalry across a flooded river to charge the enemy head-on. He would fight in the heart of the melee, cut down nobles with his own spear, and nearly die under a Persian blade before being saved by Clitus the Black. And when it was over, the Persian army lay shattered. Asia Minor opened before him like an unwatched gate. The road to conquest had begun. Alexander had completed the first phase of his mission. He had neutralized every internal threat, secured his power at home, and assembled the most sophisticated army of the age. With the entire Greek world behind him and his enemies in disarray, he could now begin the most audacious military campaign in history. The Macedonian eagle had taken flight, and it would not rest until it had soared over the palaces of Persepolis and beyond. In the autumn of 333 BCE, the paths of two kings crossed on the plains of northern Syria: Alexander of Macedonia and Darius III of Persia. Their confrontation at the Battle of Issus was one of the most iconic clashes in ancient history, a decisive encounter that would mark the true beginning of the end for the Achaemenid Empire. It was here that Alexander's tactical brilliance and sheer audacity would overcome overwhelming odds and deliver a psychological blow from which the Persian monarchy would never fully recover. Following his string of victories in Asia Minor, including the battles at Granicus and the sieges of Miletus and Halicarnassus, Alexander continued his campaign along the Mediterranean coast. His goals were strategic: to cut off Persian access to the sea, to secure his lines of communication, and to prevent the powerful Persian navy from landing troops behind him. City after city fell to his advancing army, many surrendering without a fight. Yet Alexander knew these victories were only preliminary. Darius had not yet entered the field. The Persian great king was still gathering his forces, and when he arrived, he would come with the full weight of the empire. Darius III had taken a cautious approach to war. After hearing of the disaster at Granicus, he had begun assembling a massive army drawn from across the empire's vast territories: Bactrians, Medes, Syrians, Armenians, Indians, and Greek mercenaries. The army he assembled at Babylon and later moved into Syria was colossal. Ancient sources estimate hundreds of thousands, though modern historians suggest a figure closer to 100,000 men. It included tens of thousands of cavalry-heavy infantry chariots and a well-equipped royal entourage. Darius's strategy was to confront Alexander on open terrain where his numbers could be used to full advantage. But events did not unfold as Darius had planned. Alexander, meanwhile, was advancing south with his own forces, believing Darius to be hundreds of miles to the east. The terrain in the region was narrow, hemmed in by mountains on one side and the Mediterranean Sea on the other. In a move that surprised even his own generals, Darius executed a risky maneuver. He marched his army around Alexander's rear, cutting off his supply lines and capturing the town of Issus, where wounded Macedonian soldiers had been left behind. This meant that the two armies would now meet in the narrowest of corridors, with the river Pinarus between them. This unexpected reversal forced Alexander to adapt quickly. Learning of Darius's position, he halted his southern advance and turned back north, leading his army with urgency. Though surprised by the maneuver, Alexander recognized the opportunity. In the cramped terrain near Issus, Darius's numerical advantage would be neutralized. The Persians could not deploy their full strength in such a confined space, while Alexander's smaller, highly organized force would retain its cohesion and flexibility. It was a battlefield tailor-made for Macedonian warfare. When the two armies finally faced one another, Alexander drew up his lines with characteristic precision. The Macedonian phalanx, led by experienced officers, held the center. On the right, Alexander positioned his cavalry, the elite companion unit ready to spearhead the decisive strike. Parmenion, his trusted general, commanded the left wing, reinforced by Thessalian cavalry and allied troops. Light infantry and archers screened the flanks, while reserves were kept ready in case of a breach. Darius, for his part, stationed himself at the center of the Persian line, surrounded by his personal guard and Greek mercenaries. His flanks were composed of diverse troops from across the empire: archers, cavalry, and lightly armored infantry. He had placed many hopes on his superior numbers and the strength of his center, where he expected to break through the Macedonian line. The battle began with Alexander leading a direct charge on the Persian left. His cavalry surged forward, breaking through the initial lines and forcing the enemy into retreat. The ferocity of the assault startled the Persians, and their ranks wavered under pressure. As Alexander's right advanced, he angled his attack toward the center, aiming directly for Darius himself. In the middle of the battlefield, chaos reigned. The Macedonian phalanx advanced methodically, clashing with the Persian center near the Pinarus River. Meanwhile, Darius's forces launched a fierce assault on Alexander's left wing, where Parmenion was heavily engaged and under immense pressure. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Persian right might break through, threatening to envelop the Macedonian army. Messengers were sent to Alexander, warning that his left flank was in danger. But Alexander would not be distracted. He knew the key to victory lay at the heart of the Persian line. With the momentum of his cavalry and the discipline of his infantry, he pressed his attack toward Darius. The sight of the Macedonian king approaching, weapons drawn, stirred panic in the Persian ranks. Arrows and javelins filled the air, but Alexander kept advancing. Then, in a moment, immortalized by ancient chroniclers, Darius lost his nerve. Turning his chariot around, he fled the battlefield, his guards and generals following in disarray. The collapse of Persian morale was instantaneous. As Darius retreated, the cohesion of his army dissolved. Units on both flanks began to fall back, pursued by Macedonian troops. Alexander, momentarily tempted to chase the fleeing king, instead turned back to aid Parmenion on the left, stabilizing the situation and turning what had been a close contest into a rout. By the end of the battle, Persian casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. The exact figures are debated, but the psychological impact was clear. Darius had fled, his army shattered, and his prestige destroyed. Even more devastating was the fact that Alexander captured the royal camp, including Darius's wife, daughters, and mother. Far from mistreating them, Alexander ensured they were treated with dignity and honor, further enhancing his reputation as a magnanimous conqueror. The Battle of Issus was more than a military victory. It was a turning point. Darius's flight damaged his credibility across the empire. Many satraps and governors began to question whether the great king could protect them. Some, like the rulers of Phoenician cities, began to switch sides. Alexander had proven that he could defeat Persia, not just on the frontier, but in direct confrontation with its king. From that moment on, the war ceased to be merely a campaign of conquest. It became a contest between two rulers, one destined to fall and the other determined to ascend. Darius would try again to resist raising another massive army, but he would never again command the same confidence. Alexander had shown the world what a truly brilliant commander could do, even when outnumbered and operating on foreign soil. He had taken the initiative, read the terrain, and executed a near-perfect strategy. Issus was not the end, but it was the beginning of Alexander's transformation from ambitious warlord to world-shaping emperor. After his overwhelming victory at Issus, Alexander the Great held the initiative. Darius III had fled the battlefield, his family had been captured, and the prestige of the Persian Empire was shaken to its core. For most rulers, this would have been a moment to rest, to consolidate power, and prepare for the next major engagement. But Alexander was not most rulers. He understood that speed and momentum were among his greatest weapons, and he intended to use them. His next goal was to dominate the eastern Mediterranean coastline, neutralize Persian naval power, and make his eventual march inland toward Babylon and Persepolis secure. The linchpin of this strategy was the fortified island city of Tyre, and Tyre would not surrender easily. Tyre, located off the coast of modern-day Lebanon, was one of the greatest and most prosperous cities of the ancient world. Its people were proud descendants of the Phoenician seafaring tradition, and its harbors were filled with ships that had once dominated Mediterranean trade. The city was built on a rocky island half a mile offshore, protected by massive walls that rose directly from the sea. It had resisted sieges before, including one by the great Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Alexander's army had no fleet of comparable power, and Tyre's defenders were confident that the island fortress could withstand any land-based assault. They believed that the young Macedonian king would either bypass the city or be forced into a prolonged and fruitless siege. They were wrong. At first, negotiations began politely. The Tyrians sent a diplomatic delegation to Alexander, offering friendship and allowing him to make sacrifices at their temple to Melkart, the city's patron god whom the Greeks associated with Heracles. Alexander replied with a request. He wished to enter the island city and perform the sacrifice personally. But to grant this would mean acknowledging his supremacy. The Tyrians refused, suggesting instead that he perform the ritual in Old Tyre, the mainland settlement. Alexander took the rebuff as a challenge to his authority and resolved to take the city by force. But how does one lay siege to a city in the sea? Alexander's answer was as bold as it was astonishing. He would build a causeway, a massive stone bridge from the mainland to the island. Using rubble from Old Tyre, he ordered his engineers to construct a mole 200 feet wide stretching across the water to the city walls. Progress was slow. As the mole extended into deeper water, Tyrian ships began to harass the laborers. Archers and catapults bombarded the workers from the sea, while divers sabotaged the underwater supports at night. The sea was no friend to Alexander. The winds were unpredictable, and storms often battered the construction. Nevertheless, the work continued. For months, Alexander's soldiers doubled as laborers, hauling stone timber and earth to extend the causeway. To counter the Tyrian navy, Alexander knew he needed ships of his own. He traveled north to Sidon, where many Phoenician cities, demoralized by the defeat of Darius, willingly offered their fleets to the Macedonian cause. By combining these ships with vessels from Cyprus and other Greek cities, Alexander assembled a formidable fleet, giving him the ability to blockade Tyre from the sea. Still, the Tyrians did not surrender. Instead, they launched daring nighttime attacks on the mole, setting fire to siege towers, sinking equipment, and stalling Alexander's progress. In one incident, they loaded an old transport ship with flammable materials, lit it aflame, and rammed it into Alexander's mole, destroying months of work. But Alexander responded in kind, rebuilding, reinforcing, and advancing. When the mole finally reached the walls, the assault began in earnest. Alexander ordered siege engines to be mounted on ships, essentially floating towers equipped with catapults and battering rams. These vessels sailed close to the walls and pummeled the defenses from point-blank range. Tyre's defenders met them with everything they had: heated sand thrown onto soldiers, fire arrows, javelins, and boiling oil. They constructed secondary defenses, repaired breaches under fire, and used nets and cranes to disable enemy ships. The fighting was grueling and punishing on both sides. Every inch of progress was paid for in blood and sweat. It was during this siege that Alexander displayed both his relentless determination and his tactical genius. He personally led reconnaissance missions, examined weaknesses in the walls, and adapted his approach after every failed assault. When direct attacks failed, he changed the position of his artillery. When the wind turned against him, he waited. When the Tyrians strengthened one sector of their defenses, he struck at another. Eventually, a breach was made in the southern wall. On that day, Alexander coordinated a multi-pronged assault. His fleet attacked from the northern and southern harbors, while siege ships focused fire on the newly created breach. Alexander personally led the attack through the gap-scaling ladders, sword in hand, as arrows and stones rained down. His men followed, pouring through the opening with unstoppable momentum. Inside the city, resistance collapsed quickly. Tyrian warriors fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and overwhelmed. The fighting spilled into the streets, and before long, Alexander's troops controlled the entire island. What followed was brutal. Over 6,000 Tyrians were slaughtered, and another 30,000 were sold into slavery. 2,000 captured soldiers were crucified along the shore as a warning to others. The display was harsh, even by ancient standards. But to Alexander, Tyre's defiance had demanded a terrible example. The siege had lasted 7 months, far longer than most of Alexander's campaigns. It had drained his army, cost him ships, and nearly stalled his momentum. But the outcome was decisive. Tyre had been the strongest city on the coast, its navy one of the last to resist him. With its fall, the rest of the Phoenician cities submitted quickly, Sidon, Byblos, and even the great port of Gaza. More importantly, with the fall of Tyre, Alexander had neutralized Persian naval power. The ports along the eastern Mediterranean were now under his control. No longer could the Persian fleet resupply or reinforce coastal strongholds. The sea, once a source of vulnerability, had become an asset. Alexander could now move along the coast unopposed, secure in the knowledge that his supply lines were safe. In the aftermath, Alexander made sacrifices at the Temple of Melkart, fulfilling the request that had sparked the conflict in the first place. He dedicated offerings, celebrated his victory, and honored the city's resilience even as it lay in ruins. His ability to simultaneously destroy and respect his enemies was a hallmark of his leadership. The siege of Tyre demonstrated everything that made Alexander a formidable leader: military ingenuity, relentless willpower, strategic clarity, and the ability to inspire his men, even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. But it also revealed something darker: his capacity for ruthless punishment and his belief that resistance must be crushed without mercy. For the rest of the ancient world, the message was clear. There was no fortress too strong, no city too sacred, and no distance too great to escape the reach of Alexander the Great. After the fall of Tyre, the cities of the Levant were demoralized and quick to submit. Most opened their gates without resistance, hoping to avoid the wrath that had consumed Tyre in flames and blood. Yet amid this wave of surrender, one city stood defiant: Gaza. Situated on a high hill near the edge of the Egyptian desert, Gaza was the final, major stronghold on the path to Egypt. Its fall would open the way for Alexander's march into the ancient land of the pharaohs. But Gaza, unlike Sidon or Byblos, did not tremble. Instead, it braced for war. The Persian governor of Gaza, Battus, was a fierce and determined leader. He had fortified the city, in advance filling its granaries, preparing siege defenses, and arming a contingent of Arab mercenaries to bolster the garrison. Battus had no illusions about Alexander's abilities. He knew the Macedonian king had just brought down the seemingly impregnable city of Tyre, but he believed that Gaza's position and strength gave it a chance. Perched on a mound of solid earth and surrounded by thick walls, Gaza was well prepared for a siege. More importantly, it controlled the key crossroads between Syria and Egypt. Battus knew that Alexander would have to come, and he was ready to make him pay for every stone. When Alexander arrived in late 332 BCE, he found a city unlike the others. There was no delegation, no surrender, and no negotiation. The gates were shut, the walls manned, and the defenders ready. The king ordered his army to encamp on the southern side of the city, where the terrain seemed most favorable for an assault. But Gaza sat on a high plateau of shifting desert sands, and the construction of siege works proved challenging from the outset. The siege towers and rams that had been so effective at Tyre bogged down before they could even reach the walls. Frustrated, Alexander ordered his engineers to raise the ground itself, constructing a massive mound of earth to level the battlefield and bring his siege engines up to the base of the fortress. The project was laborious. Thousands of men toiled for days hauling sand timber and stone. The defenders, meanwhile, did not sit idle. Using slings, bows, and artillery, they harassed the Macedonians, constantly killing workers and disrupting progress. But Alexander pressed on, determined to subdue the city, before turning his eyes to Egypt. It was during this period that an ill omen struck. A crow flew overhead during a religious ceremony and dropped a clump of dirt onto Alexander's head before flying off and perching atop a siege tower. His seer Aristander interpreted the event with cautious optimism. The city would fall, but not without harm to the king. That prophecy soon came to pass. During one of the early skirmishes near the walls, Alexander personally led a sortie against a group of Arab mercenaries who had sallied out from the gate. As he engaged the enemy, he was struck by a projectile. Some accounts say an arrow, others a catapult bolt, which pierced his shoulder and knocked him to the ground. His men rallied to defend him and dragged him back to camp. Though the wound was serious, Alexander refused to show weakness. He ordered his physician to treat him quickly, and soon after, he returned to directing the siege. As the mound rose and the siege engines moved into range, Alexander launched the first of several major assaults. Siege towers bristling with catapults advanced, battering the walls and unleashing volleys of projectiles. Rams struck the stone with rhythmic thunder, yet each attack was met with ferocious resistance. The defenders repelled wave after wave, rebuilding breaches under fire and launching counterattacks to burn Macedonian machines. On 3 separate occasions, Alexander's forces reached the walls only to be thrown back with heavy casualties. But Alexander was not a man easily deterred. With every failure, he adjusted. He rotated his troops, repaired his equipment, and reinforced his mound. Finally, after weeks of effort, the wall buckled. A breach opened in the defenses, and Alexander prepared for the final strike. This time, he would lead the assault himself, wounded or not. At dawn, the Macedonians launched their 4th and final assault. Siege towers rolled forward, rams smashed through weakened sections, and thousands of infantry poured into the city. The defenders, exhausted but defiant, met them in brutal hand-to-hand combat. In the chaos, Alexander's men pushed through the breach and began flooding into the interior. The fighting raged in the streets, but the momentum had shifted. The Macedonians had broken through. Battus, the Persian governor, made a last stand. He and his most loyal fighters retreated to the citadel, where they continued to resist, even after the rest of the city had fallen. According to one account, he fought to the very end, wounded, but unyielding, refusing to surrender, even when surrounded. Captured alive, Battus was brought before Alexander in chains. The king, still nursing his shoulder wound and stung by the stubborn resistance, demanded submission. When Battus remained silent, Alexander flew into a rage. Some sources claim that in a symbolic act of revenge, Alexander had Battus tied to a chariot and dragged around the city walls, echoing Achilles' treatment of Hector in Homeric myth. The rest of the city was less fortunate. Thousands of civilians were slaughtered or enslaved, and Gaza's proud resistance was turned into a cautionary tale. The Macedonians looted the city, dismantled its defenses, and left it garrisoned under friendly control. Gaza, like Tyre before, it had been made an example. Yet Alexander's victory at Gaza was also a turning point. With the last Persian stronghold in the region destroyed, the path to Egypt lay wide open. The road from Syria into the Nile Delta was now unguarded. In a matter of days, Alexander would march south, welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. In Egypt, he would find new wonders, be crowned a god, and found one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, Alexandria. But the siege of Gaza remained etched into memory. It had tested Alexander's patience, wounded his body, and stoked his anger. It reminded his men and his enemies that he would not tolerate defiance. It also showed the world that his victories were not won by luck or inherited advantage. They were earned through will strategy and relentless perseverance. The conquest of Gaza was not just a battle. It was a message one carved into stone blood and legend. After the brutal siege of Gaza, Alexander stood on the doorstep of one of the most fabled lands of the ancient world, Egypt. For centuries, this land of pyramids, pharaohs, and divine kingship had been ruled by foreign powers, first the Assyrians, then the Persians. To the people of Egypt, Persian rule had brought exploitation and neglect. Their temples had been desecrated, their gods disrespected, and their cultural independence stifled. So, when word spread that the conqueror who had crushed the Persian armies and humbled Tyre was marching south Egypt, did not prepare for resistance. It prepared for deliverance. Alexander's march through the Sinai Desert toward Egypt was arduous but strategically sound. He advanced quickly, following the coast, and making use of his naval fleet to provide supplies. When he reached Pelusium, the gateway to the Nile Delta, he was met not with an army, but with open gates and cheering crowds. The Persian satrap, Mazekis, lacking the forces to resist and unwilling to fight a losing battle, surrendered peacefully. With a simple gesture, Alexander gained control of one of the wealthiest provinces of the Persian Empire without drawing a sword. The Egyptians, long resentful of Persian domination, welcomed Alexander with enthusiasm. Temples were reopened, priests greeted him with chants, and sacred rites were performed in his honor. From the beginning, Alexander was careful to portray himself not merely as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He adopted Egyptian customs, wore traditional garments during public ceremonies, and participated in rituals that affirmed his role as pharaoh. Though he never took the formal title during his lifetime, he was recognized in temples and by the people as the rightful ruler of Egypt, son of Ra, divine and appointed. In Memphis, the traditional capital of Egypt, Alexander presided over a lavish ceremony of coronation and celebration. He made sacrifices to Apis, the sacred bull deity, and received the blessings of Egyptian priests. This was more than political theater. It was strategic diplomacy. By respecting the local religion and aligning himself with Egyptian traditions, Alexander ensured the loyalty of the priesthood, which in Egypt was the key to both civil administration and spiritual legitimacy. But Alexander's ambitions in Egypt extended far beyond ceremony. He had always seen himself as not merely a military leader, but a founder of cities, a bringer of order, and a cultivator of civilization. The chaos of war in his mind was not an end in itself. It was a means to reshape the world. And no project reflected this vision more clearly than his founding of Alexandria. During his journey westward along the Mediterranean coast, Alexander reached a narrow strip of land between the sea and a large lake opposite the island of Pharos. The site, though undeveloped, captivated him. It was perfectly located, defensible by nature, close to the Nile near trade routes, and positioned to be a bridge between Greece and Egypt. There was no great city in this part of the delta, only fishing villages and marshes. But Alexander saw something more. According to ancient sources, Alexander personally sketched the layout of the city with flour or barley meal on the sand. He marked out the walls, the streets, the temples, and the harbor. When birds swooped down and ate the grain, a seemingly bad omen, his seer reassured him that it meant the city would be filled with life and sustenance. Taking it as a sign of divine favor, Alexander ordered the construction of Alexandria to begin immediately. Though he would not live to see its completion, Alexandria would go on to become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. It would be home to the Library of Alexandria, the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world, and a vibrant mix of cultures, Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and more. It was a city built in his name, but designed for the ages. But Alexander's time in Egypt was not only about urban planning and ceremonial pageantry. He had one more objective, a deeply personal and symbolic one. He wished to consult the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis, far to the west in the Libyan desert. This oracle, long revered by both Egyptians and Greeks, was said to speak the will of Zeus Ammon, a fusion of deities from both cultures. Previous kings, including the mythic Heracles and the historical pharaohs, had made pilgrimages to Siwa. Now, Alexander would do the same. The journey was perilous. The desert was vast, scorching by day and freezing by night. Water was scarce, and the caravan nearly lost its way in the shifting sands. Ancient writers speak of divine interventions, of sudden rainstorms that saved the men from thirst, or of birds that led the party to safety. Whether myth or truth, the journey only added to Alexander's mystique. When he finally arrived at the oasis, he was welcomed by the priests of the temple. What transpired during the consultation remains a mystery. The priests, speaking through interpreters, declared Alexander to be the son of a god. Some say they hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon. Others report that Alexander asked about the fate of his father's assassins and was told they had been justly punished. What is certain is that Alexander left Siwa convinced that his divine heritage had been affirmed. This belief in his divine origin was more than a personal delusion. It became a political tool. By aligning himself with gods, Alexander created a persona that transcended kingship. He was no longer merely a man. He was a figure of destiny, chosen by the heavens to rule and unite the world. In Egypt, that idea found fertile ground. The culture already accepted the divinity of rulers, and Alexander fit easily into that paradigm. His time in Egypt was brief, just a few months, but it left a lasting impact. He reorganized the administration, respected local traditions, installed trusted officials, and left the province in peace and prosperity. Unlike his brutal campaigns elsewhere, Egypt required no massacres, no mass enslavements, and no prolonged sieges. It was a rare moment of harmony in an otherwise turbulent conquest. As he prepared to leave Egypt and rejoin his army for the next stage of the campaign. Alexander stood atop the foundations of a new city that bore his name with the Nile at his back and the desert stretching towards Siwa. He had been embraced as a god crowned as a pharaoh and hailed as a liberator. The Persian Empire still stood. But now, Alexander had the resources of Egypt at his disposal, a loyal population behind him, and a divine mandate, real or imagined, driving him forward. The march east was about to resume, but Egypt would never forget the man who entered as a conqueror and left as a god. Among all the extraordinary episodes in Alexander the Great's life, his pilgrimage to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa stands apart, not for its military significance, but for its deep symbolic and spiritual implications. It was a moment of mystery prophecy and divine affirmation. While Egypt had already received Alexander as a pharaoh, a son of Ra, and a liberator from Persian rule, it was at the remote desert oasis of Siwa that Alexander's belief in his own divinity was crystallized. The journey was treacherous, the destination sacred, and the experience transformative. After the peaceful conquest of Egypt and the founding of Alexandria, most military leaders would have paused to plan their next campaign. Not Alexander. For him, Egypt was not just a province, it was a spiritual gateway. He had learned early that religion and politics were deeply intertwined, especially in cultures like Egypt's, where divine kingship was not a metaphor, but a living institution. To be king in Egypt meant more than ruling, it meant embodying the gods. And if Alexander were to rule not just Egypt, but the entire known world, he needed more than soldiers and strategy. He needed to become a figure of legend. The Oracle of Ammon, located deep in the Libyan desert, at the oasis of Siwa, was one of the most revered religious sites in the ancient world, known to the Greeks as a manifestation of Zeus Ammon, and to the Egyptians as a form of the sun god Ra. The oracle was believed to offer divine guidance. Few made the journey, and fewer still returned, with what Alexander sought confirmation that he was not only a great man, but a god. Alexander set out for Siwa with a small entourage that included trusted companions and soldiers, among them Ptolemy, who would later rule Egypt. The route was long and dangerous. Over 300 miles of desert separated Siwa from the Nile. They traveled westward along the coastal road toward Paratonian, modern-day Mersa Matruh, and then veered inland, plunging into the unforgiving expanse of sand and stone. It was a journey of faith as much as logistics. The harshness of the environment tested even Alexander's legendary endurance. The desert did not welcome them. Supplies ran low. The sun scorched them by day, and the freezing nights sapped their strength. According to ancient sources, especially the accounts of Curtius Rufus and Plutarch, several omens and miracles marked the journey. One tale speaks of a great storm that appeared just as the caravan was on the brink of dehydration, delivering rain that saved the men and their animals. Another tells of birds, perhaps ravens or hawks, guiding the party when they became lost, leading them to safety through a sandstorm. Though some of these stories may be embellishments or later mythologizing, they point to a crucial truth. The journey was not only difficult, it was perceived as a divine test. The deeper Alexander ventured into the desert, the more he stepped outside the realm of human kingship and into the world of myth. He was retracing the steps of heroes and demigods, making his way to a place where history blurred into legend. When the caravan finally reached Siwa, the contrast must have been astonishing. Amid the barren sands, the oasis bloomed with palm trees, springs, and temples. The oracle itself was housed in a shrine dedicated to Ammon, where priests lived in seclusion, performing sacred rites and interpreting the will of the gods. The temple, surrounded by sacred groves and pools, was a place of quiet majesty. Alexander was welcomed with reverence. The priests had surely heard of his victories, his founding of Alexandria, and his acceptance as pharaoh in Memphis. But what occurred inside the temple remains one of the most tantalizing mysteries of antiquity. According to Plutarch and other sources, Alexander entered alone. No official record survives of what was said within those sacred walls. Alexander himself was notably silent afterward, confiding only in his closest companions. What is known is this: when he emerged from the temple, his demeanor had changed. He was no longer merely Alexander the king. He was Alexander, son of a god. Some reports claim that the priests greeted him as son of Zeus Ammon. Others say he asked questions, and the oracle gave responses that confirmed his divine birth and future glory. Perhaps he asked whether he had avenged his father Philip, or whether he would rule the world. Whatever the specifics, the result was clear. The oracle had validated his belief that he was not just favored by the gods, but descended from them. For the Greeks in his entourage, this was unsettling. Many of them still clung to the idea of Alexander as a mortal leader, extraordinary, but not divine. They were not accustomed to worshiping a living man. For the Egyptians, however, the declaration was familiar. Their pharaohs had long been considered divine sons of the sun god. In many ways, Alexander's deification was less about personal ego and more about political integration. To rule Egypt in the east, he had to become a god. The visit to Siwa would cast a long shadow over Alexander's remaining years. From this point on, he referred to Zeus Ammon in inscriptions. Coins would be minted with his image bearing divine attributes. He would expect foreign dignitaries to bow before him, not just out of custom, but out of reverence. This insistence on his divinity would become a point of friction with his Macedonian generals, who had grown up treating him as a comrade, not a deity. But for Alexander, the Siwa oracle was more than political theater. It was the culmination of his destiny. He believed that his path had always been divinely guided. His military genius, his charismatic leadership, and his nearly miraculous victories were signs of divine favor. At Siwa, that favor had been made explicit. The journey back to Egypt was quieter, more reflective. Alexander had seen visions in the desert, spoken to gods, and returned with a new sense of identity. He had entered as a conqueror and left as a demigod. With the blessing of the gods and the authority of kingship in both East and West, he was now ready for the next phase of his conquest. The Persian heartland still lay ahead. Babylon, Persepolis, Susa cities rich in power and myth. But Alexander would meet them not merely as a general of the West, but as a man crowned by gods, hailed by priests, and guided, as he believed, by destiny itself. By the time Alexander approached the plains of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, He was no longer merely a Macedonian king marching east. He had become a symbol of unstoppable will, divine favor, and military brilliance. He had defeated Persian armies at Granicus and Issus, crushed the fortress of Tyre, and been hailed as a god in Egypt. Now, he marched into Mesopotamia, into the very heart of the Persian Empire, to confront the great King Darius III one last time. The upcoming clash would be more than a battle. It would be a reckoning, a decisive confrontation between two worlds. On one side stood a coalition of Persian might. On the other, Alexander and his army vastly outnumbered, but infinitely more cohesive. Darius had not been idle since his humiliating defeat at Issus. After retreating to the eastern provinces, he had spent nearly a year raising a new army, one larger and more diverse than any he had ever commanded. Troops were conscripted from across his vast dominion: Scythian cavalry from the steppes, Bactrians from Central Asia, Indian elephants from the east, archers from Persia, foot soldiers from Mesopotamia, and elite immortal guards from the royal court. The final force, according to ancient sources, numbered over 200,000. Though this number is likely exaggerated, modern historians generally estimate Darius had well over 100,000 troops at his command, at least double the size of Alexander's army. But Darius did more than just raise troops. This time, he learned from his previous defeats. At Issus, his army had been cramped between the mountains and the sea, unable to maneuver. At Gaugamela, he would choose the battlefield. He selected a broad, open plain near the Tigris River and ordered it leveled rocks were cleared, vegetation removed, and the ground flattened to accommodate his cavalry and chariots. He was determined to exploit his numerical advantage and crush the smaller Macedonian army with a sweeping envelopment. Alexander, for his part, also prepared meticulously. His army was smaller, about 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, but it was highly disciplined, experienced, and fiercely loyal. The core of the force was the Macedonian phalanx, wielding the long sarissa pike in dense formation. His cavalry included the elite companion cavalry, Thessalian horsemen, and light skirmishers. These were not just soldiers, they were veterans who had fought through rivers, sieges, deserts, and across thousands of miles of enemy territory. They trusted Alexander implicitly. When scouts reported Darius's position and the scale of his forces, Alexander's officers urged caution. Some even suggested a night attack to disrupt the Persian camp before battle could begin. But Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory," he reportedly said. He believed the gods favored him, and more than that, he knew morale was on his side. He wanted the world to witness that he could beat the great king in open battle with no tricks or ambushes. On the morning of the battle, October 1st, 331 BCE, the Macedonian army advanced in formation. Alexander placed his phalanx in the center, his companion cavalry and hypaspists, elite infantry, on the right, and the Thessalians on the left under Parmenion. He staggered the lines and positioned reserves at the rear to respond to Persian maneuvers. It was a flexible, reactive force, ideal for the kind of fluid battle Alexander anticipated. Opposite them, Darius arranged his army in a vast horizontal line stretching far beyond Alexander's flanks. Chariots with scythed wheels were placed in the center, elephants, symbolic as much as tactical, stood as exotic war beasts. Massive numbers of cavalry were positioned on each wing, prepared to envelop the Macedonian line. Darius himself stood in the center in a golden chariot surrounded by his royal guard. Confident in his numbers and position, he waited for the Macedonian attack. What followed was one of the most brilliant tactical displays in ancient history. Rather than launching a direct assault, Alexander began by slowly advancing his right flank at an angle, drawing part of the Persian cavalry further out. Darius, seeing Alexander moving toward his left, responded by shifting forces to counter the maneuver. It was a subtle trick, but it worked. The Persian line began to stretch and weaken. As Persian cavalry surged forward to encircle the Macedonian right, Alexander sent out his light infantry and archers to disrupt the chariots before they could gain momentum. Many were stopped before reaching the lines, tangled in caltrops, or targeted by javelins. Others were funneled harmlessly between gaps in the phalanx, where they were quickly cut down. Then came the moment Alexander had orchestrated. As the Persian line drifted and a gap opened in the center, Alexander gathered his companion cavalry into a tight wedge and charged directly through it. With a thunderous cry, they smashed into the Persian core, piercing straight toward Darius himself. The suddenness and precision of the assault created chaos. Darius, once again facing the very real possibility of capture or death, panicked. His chariot turned and fled. The king's flight was seen by his troops, and morale collapsed almost instantly. But the battle wasn't over. While Alexander had broken the center, the Persian left and right wings were still engaged. Parmenion, commanding the Macedonian left, was hard-pressed by Persian cavalry that had nearly broken through. Messengers rode to Alexander, urging him to assist. He was torn. Pursuing Darius could end the war right then and there. But if his army was overrun from the flank, victory could turn to disaster. He made the hard choice. Turning from the pursuit, Alexander rode with his cavalry across the field to support Parmenion. Together, they pushed back the Persian horse and sealed the victory. The battlefield was strewn with bodies. Thousands of Persian soldiers were dead, including many high-ranking nobles and generals. Darius escaped once more, but his empire would never recover. The Macedonian losses were relatively light, though several hundred were killed. For such a massive and decisive engagement, the casualty ratio was staggering. Gaugamela was not just a battlefield triumph. It was a psychological catastrophe for Persia. After this battle, Alexander was no longer seen as a general or even a king. He was viewed by many in the East and West alike as invincible. The consequences were immediate. Cities that once served Darius began to surrender. Babylon, one of the greatest cities of the world, opened its gates without a fight. Susa, with its immense treasury, followed. Even Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, lay within reach. But Gaugamela's impact went beyond politics and geography. It established Alexander as a tactician of genius. He had used terrain feints, timing, and unit coordination to dismantle a much larger force. He had turned a near-hopeless numerical situation into a moment of absolute dominance. Darius would attempt to regroup in the east, but he no longer commanded the loyalty of his satraps. Many began plotting against him, believing Alexander would soon be their new king, and they were right. At Gaugamela, Alexander didn't just win a battle. He shattered an empire and crowned himself not with gold, but with glory, carved from strategy, speed, and sheer brilliance. In the aftermath of the monumental victory at Gaugamela, the course of world history tilted decisively. The Persian Empire, though not yet formally dismantled, had been mortally wounded. Its armies had been scattered, its royal authority broken, and its great king Darius III had fled the battlefield for a second time. Yet even in retreat, Darius remained the symbolic heart of Persian resistance. Until he was captured or killed, Alexander's conquest would remain unfinished. An Alexander who believed that destiny had chosen him to rule not only Greece, but the entire known world, had no intention of stopping until that mission was complete. Following the battle, Alexander did not immediately pursue Darius. Instead, he marched to the ancient city of Babylon, one of the most storied capitals in human civilization. Expecting resistance, he instead found open gates and enthusiastic surrender. The city's governor, Mazias, who had fought against Alexander at Gaugamela, now offered his allegiance, and Alexander, in a striking display of pragmatism, allowed him to remain as satrap. This was a new phase in Alexander's approach, blending conquest with accommodation. He was not simply smashing through enemy territory, he was beginning to rule. At Babylon, Alexander rewarded his soldiers generously distributed treasure taken from the city and took part in religious ceremonies to honor both local and Greek gods. His treatment of Babylon and its inhabitants was symbolic. Here he began casting himself not just as a conqueror, but as a legitimate successor to the kings of Persia. From Babylon, he marched to Susa, another great Persian capital. The treasury there held staggering wealth, some 50,000 talents of gold and silver, by ancient estimates, more than enough to finance his entire campaign many times over. Again, the city surrendered without resistance. The Persian elite were beginning to realize that Darius could no longer protect them, and that Alexander, far from being a barbaric invader, was positioning himself as their next great ruler. As Alexander advanced deeper into the empire, he approached Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian identity and the symbolic seat of Achaemenid kingship. It was here that he could deliver the final blow to the old dynasty. Though Darius was not present, the fall of Persepolis would mark the symbolic end of Persian supremacy. After a brief but fierce resistance outside the city, Alexander's forces broke through, and the capital was his. He entered its grand halls, walked the same paths as Cyrus and Xerxes, and stood among the treasures and tributes of centuries of imperial rule. Persepolis did not escape the wrath that Alexander had so carefully withheld elsewhere, perhaps in retribution for the burning of Athens by Xerxes more than a century earlier, or perhaps in a drunken celebration. Alexander allowed the palace complex to be burned. The flames consumed royal archives, artworks, and architecture. Some accounts say Alexander regretted the act. Others suggest it was a calculated message the age of Persia was over and a new world order had begun. Yet Darius still lived, retreating ever further eastward, hoping to raise a new army and reestablish authority. Alexander pursued him, relentlessly crossing deserts and mountain ranges, knowing that the war could not truly end until the last Achaemenid king was in his grasp. Along the way, he left behind garrisons, appointed satraps, sometimes Persian, sometimes Macedonian, and maintained order in the lands he now ruled. His empire was growing, but it was also stabilizing. Darius's final refuge was in the region of Bactria, near modern-day Afghanistan. Here, he was betrayed by his own men. The satrap, Bessus, seeing Darius as a liability, arrested the king and declared himself the new ruler under the name Artaxerxes V. He hoped to continue resistance against Alexander under new leadership. But when Alexander's cavalry approached Bessus and his allies panicked, Darius was mortally wounded by his own guards and left to die in a wagon on the roadside. When Alexander found the dying king, it was too late. Darius had been abandoned, bleeding, and alone. He was barely alive. According to the ancient sources, Alexander cradled the wounded monarch in his arms and promised to avenge him. Darius, they say, expressed gratitude, asked Alexander to care for his family, and accepted him as his true successor. Whether or not this exchange truly happened is debated, but what is certain is that Alexander treated the fallen king with remarkable honor. He sent his body back to Persepolis for burial alongside the other Achaemenid rulers. This was not just an act of respect, it was a claim. By burying Darius with royal honors, Alexander symbolically assumed the role of his heir. No longer merely a foreign conqueror, he presented himself as the lawful king of Asia. This was more than rhetoric. Alexander now wore the Persian royal robes, used the ceremonial titles, and adopted aspects of Persian court customs. He demanded proskynesis, a ritual bow from his subjects, something Greeks considered servile, but Persians viewed as standard. These changes alarmed many of his Macedonian followers, who saw them as a betrayal of their Hellenic traditions. But for Alexander, it was a natural step. To rule a vast and diverse empire, he believed he must become a ruler that all his subjects could recognize. In his eyes, the conquest of Persia was not just military, it was philosophical. He envisioned a fusion of East and West, a new world shaped by Greek culture and Persian grandeur. He began marrying Eastern customs with Western ideals, integrating Persians into his administration and even taking a Persian wife. To many of his men, these were strange and alien decisions. But Alexander was no longer merely the king of Macedonia. He was now the self-declared King of Kings, heir to both Achilles and Cyrus. With Darius gone and no legitimate rival to his authority, Alexander began to consolidate his empire. He appointed satraps, oversaw infrastructure projects, and planned new cities across the territories he had conquered. But he also remained restless. To him, there was always another horizon, another challenge, another unknown to master. Even with Persia defeated, his ambitions had only grown. The death of Darius marked the end of an era. The Achaemenid dynasty, which had ruled over the largest empire the world had ever known, had come to an end, not by civil war, not by internal collapse, but by the relentless advance of a man who believed himself destined to rule everything he could see. In claiming Darius's crown, Alexander did more than end a war. He claimed the soul of an empire and reshaped history in his own image. With Darius III dead and the Persian Empire effectively conquered, Alexander the Great stood at the pinnacle of power. He ruled over the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of Central Asia. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the great capitals of the East, had all bowed before him. He had been crowned pharaoh in Egypt, hailed as king in Persia, and proclaimed as a god at Siwa. To many, this would have been enough, a lifetime of glory and conquest. But Alexander's ambition was not satisfied by victory alone. His eyes now turned beyond Persia, toward lands unknown to Greeks, places shrouded in mystery and myth. He would not rest until he had reached the edge of the world. This was no longer just a campaign, it was an obsession. Alexander believed in destiny, in prophecy, and above all, in immortality. Conquest to him was not about plunder or politics, it was about transcending mortality, proving himself a hero, worthy of legends. He had studied Homer, as a child idolized Achilles, and now sought to outdo even the greatest of mythic figures. And so, despite his empire's vastness and the weariness of his army, Alexander prepared to march further east into Bactria Sogdiana and the lands beyond the Oxus and Indus rivers. The eastern provinces of the former Persian Empire were not like the cities of Mesopotamia or Egypt. They were rugged, tribal, and fiercely independent. Bactria, in particular, was a land of mountains and strongholds. There, Alexander faced one of his most formidable enemies, not a king, but a former satrap turned rebel Bessus, the man who had betrayed and murdered Darius. Declaring himself king, under the name Artaxerxes V, Bessus tried to rally resistance in Central Asia, but Alexander was relentless. Over the course of several grueling campaigns, he pursued Bessus through mountain passes, across rivers, and into the steppes. In these campaigns, Alexander faced not only military resistance, but environmental extremes, brutal winters, long supply lines, and unfamiliar terrain, yet he adapted. He founded cities along the way, garrisoned key points, and recruited local troops to supplement his forces. Eventually, Bessus was captured by his own men and handed over to Alexander, who ordered a harsh punishment. Bessus was mutilated and executed, a symbolic act of justice for his betrayal of Darius. But even with Bessus gone, resistance flared. In the rugged region of Sogdiana, Alexander faced a guerrilla war, led by tribal leaders like Spidomenes, who eluded open battle and harassed supply lines. To counter this, Alexander divided his army, built fortresses, and conducted rapid winter campaigns that stunned his enemies. He used speed, surprise, and diplomacy in equal measure. He married Roxana, the daughter of a local noble, both out of love and as a political gesture to cement his ties to the region. Still, the fighting dragged on, and the strain on his troops grew. Back in the west, some of his Macedonian commanders began to grumble. They had followed him across thousands of miles, fought dozens of battles, and now found themselves in the snow-covered highlands of an unknown world. But Alexander would not turn back. He had begun to wear Persian robes, adopt Eastern customs, and demand that his officers bow before him, a practice called proskynesis. Many of his men, especially the older Macedonians, viewed these changes with suspicion. They saw their king slipping away into something else, something no longer entirely Greek or Macedonian. Yet Alexander believed that to rule a global empire, he had to become a global king. He encouraged intermarriage between his officers and Persian women. He trained young Persians in Macedonian military tactics. He integrated foreign soldiers into his elite units. This fusion of cultures was unprecedented and controversial. It marked a clear break from the practices of earlier conquerors who had imposed their rule from a distance. Alexander wanted to merge East and West to erase the lines that divided the known world. Eventually, his ambitions carried him into India, a land so distant and mysterious to the Greeks that it might as well have been another planet. Crossing the Hindu Kush, Alexander fought against King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE. It was one of the most difficult battles of his career. Porus brought war elephants and disciplined infantry, and the battle was fought in torrential rain on flooded ground. Alexander outmaneuvered his opponent by crossing the river upstream and attacking from an unexpected angle. The victory was hard-won, and Alexander, in a rare gesture of respect, allowed Porus to retain his kingdom as a subordinate ruler. It was after this battle at the eastern edge of the Indus Valley that Alexander's army finally refused to go any farther. Exhausted, homesick, and increasingly wary of their leader's boundless ambition, they mutinied at the Hyphasis River. Alexander, after pleading and sulking, ultimately relented. He agreed to turn back, not in defeat, but in the knowledge that his empire already spanned more than any before it. The return journey was arduous. Alexander led his troops south along the Indus, building cities and battling local tribes. Eventually, he split his forces. One group sailed down the coast under his admiral Nearchus, while Alexander himself led a brutal march through the Gedrosian desert, where thousands died of thirst and heat. It was one of his greatest miscalculations, but also a testament to his stubbornness and endurance. He emerged from the desert with his core army intact, hardened by suffering, and bound to him by shared ordeal. Back in Persia, Alexander began reorganizing his empire. He held mass weddings between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, presided over lavish ceremonies, and planned new conquests: Arabia, perhaps even Carthage, and the Western Mediterranean. He dreamed of circumnavigating Africa, of uniting the world under one banner. His ambition, far from fading, only seemed to intensify. But fate had other plans. In 323 BCE, just as he was preparing a new campaign, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. After days of fever, he died possibly of malaria, typhoid poisoning, or complications from exhaustion. He was only 32 years old. At his death, he left behind an empire that stretched from Greece to India, composed of dozens of peoples, languages, and faiths. No clear successor had been named. His generals would soon fall into civil war, carving up the empire he had built with such brilliance and intensity. But the legend endured. Alexander had reached the edges of the known world. Though he never found the ocean that marked its final boundary, he had crossed deserts, rivers, and mountains that no Greek had ever dared to approach. He had brought with him the ideas of Hellenic culture, fusing them with the traditions of the East. And in doing so, he reshaped the ancient world. His ambition had no limits. His story had no equal.